All right. So I don't know how many of you picked up on how many lessons I released this week. We were pumping through them. So we got through not all of them. We didn't get through all the ones I wanted to talk about. We got through most of them. I'm going to delay the release of this one until I finish the other one, so it's in a chronological order. But I wanted to teach this to you guys specifically, and so that's why we're going to end up here. So these are pretty much the majority of the green flag translations. There are other green flag translations, but these are generally the ones that I'm going to recommend to people. And so the question is, with all of these here, all right, with all of these here, there still can be and will be probably a sense of translation paralysis still occurring. There's still a lot of translations to choose from. And so even with the prerequisites that I set out at the beginning of the class to help eliminate a whole lot of them, we still have quite a few up here. And so what I would like to do today is kind of walk you through the process by which I came to the decision to make the CSB my primary Bible. And now, this isn't an attempt to get you to switch your primary Bible to the CSB. What it is just a practical exercise to help you think about things and eliminate the paralysis for people who might have it. So if you're standing there and you're like, I don't know what to choose, so on and so forth, and you're listening to this series, here's kind of the journey of how I got to the CSB as mine. You might have got to the ESV or the NASB or the NIV or the NET your own way, and I'm okay with that. I'm not asking you to switch. If you're using one of those, great. There's no need to change unless you think you could be better edified by another one up here. That's okay too. Don't feel like you have to stay with a translation because you picked it. Don't feel like you have to switch because I'm talking about this one, all right? Just don't be paralyzed. Read your Bible. Okay, and we'll keep going. So obviously, you know, the beginning of my journey, my primary Bible was the KJV. It was selected for me, right? My pastor used it, taught my parents used it, my parents picked it for me. So the KJV was picked for me. And I used it my whole life. When I realized other people in my church were struggling with their Bibles, before I left KJV onlyism, I began to find ways to incorporate the benefits of modern translations without actually adopting them. I had already had a background in linguistics, and I was already familiar with Greek and Hebrew, so I knew what I could work with. And I had been using Greek and Hebrew resources for a long time, but I had realized through multiple conversations that people in my church didn't know how to use the Greek and Hebrew resources like I did, or like my dad did, or like my pastor did. We were using them all the time, and we would teach from the Greek and Hebrew because people weren't understanding their KJV, so we would go back to the Greek and Hebrew and then retranslate into modern English. And furthermore, I also heard men in our church preach, and they even attempted just to use English dictionaries like I've told you to do, English dictionaries to help them preach and teach. But I realized even that they were quickly using dictionaries inappropriately. One particular man picked the wrong sense from the dictionary and preached an otherwise good message, but based it off of a misunderstanding of a word, and largely because he didn't know the difference between a transitive and intransitive verb. And so when he went down to his dictionary, he saw a list of senses for transitive, and he saw a list of senses for intransitive. He just picked one. I asked him, I was trying to help him, and I asked him how he picked that one. He was like, I just thought that was the right one. And I was like, well, in this case, you got it wrong, and you based your entire message on this verb. And so the message itself was good. It's just, it was misapplied from Scripture. I wanted to find ways to help people to do good Bible study work with the resources they had available. And I recognized the benefits of modern translations in this area since there was far more agreement than disagreement in the various translations with the underlying text. And I knew how to recognize textual variants. I could recognize the textual variants that would impact the text, so I wouldn't accidentally teach a CT or reasoned eclectic word. I could teach just from the TR and do that, and so I could recognize that. So I started to use modern translations to help me recognize the textual variants and pick natural sounding English syntax. And I would use the NIV primarily for that. I would use the NIV and then combine it with the concordance and more word-for-word philosophy of the NASB and ESV. And I would use the NKJV to help me make sure that I was teaching from the TR in regular English, that I was understanding the KJV English word appropriately, and use its footnotes to make sure they were TR words. So I was doing all of this. And this was really helpful. It helped me make sure that I wasn't misunderstanding my Bible. I was giving myself guardrails by using original language scholars so I wouldn't pick the wrong sense. And this was working for me. I realized, though, that my pastor was doing very much of the same thing, because I would pick up on things that he would say during the message, and I understood he got that from a modern translation. He was using them in his personal study. So I knew I wasn't totally off track, but I wasn't telling anybody what I was doing either. And I remember specifically after one sermon, the pastor spent a good 10 or 15 minutes explaining to us what the Greek said to tell us what the KJV said. And after that one sermon, one particular man came up to me and said, everything he just said was exactly how the ESV says it here. And he opened the app on his phone and he proceeded to show me. And I couldn't help but smile because I knew what was happening. Modern translations could really help people understand their Bible. Another man in my church whose first language was French confessed to me that he privately, he was whispering to me. He told me he was using modern English Bibles to help him understand his KJV. He didn't want other people to hear him say that. I encouraged him to keep doing it. I also encouraged him to get a French Bible since his native language was French. Like, read a French Bible. One of the deacon's wives came over to our house to visit with my wife. And at one point, she had confessed to my wife that she didn't bother with her devotions anymore because she couldn't understand the KJV. I showed her a couple of things she could do to help her understand her Bible, like using a Spanish Bible because her native language was Spanish. Apparently, I had crossed the line because after that, her husband never let her come over again without his presence. And they distanced themselves from us altogether, and today that friendship is no longer present. Another lady in our church came to me discouraged that she couldn't understand her KJV, and I gave her KJV-based resources to help her. But none of these resources were free online. They all had to be purchased, and when I added up all of the resources that I thought would be necessary to help her to get all these nuances and so on and so forth, it was a $300 bill. And I was like, this isn't sustainable. She's on a fixed income. This isn't working. That's what led me eventually to talk with my pastor about doing a revision to the KJV. My wife called me one day while I was at work, frustrated, because she felt like she was going through the motions in reading her Bible, but she wasn't getting much out of it on most days. She could understand the individual words, but not the way they were put together. And later, I got home and I asked my kids about their devotions, and I asked how they were doing. And they also admitted to me that on most days, they didn't get much. And I told them from that day forward, you're no longer going to use the KJV exclusively. Go back to my bookshelf, and take any Bible off my bookshelf and use it in conjunction with their KJV moving forward. Everyone acknowledged in my home that they saw a near immediate improvement in their devotions and study. I explained this to my pastor, who admitted that he was using modern translations in his study, and I pitched the idea about allowing people to do what we were already doing. And by allow, all I meant was free their conscience, because they all felt like they were doing something wrong. And they weren't. So long story short, this whole idea was rejected. Eventually, secret meetings were held about me and what to do with me. I was a problem in the church. And there were those who understood what I was doing and tried to defend me, and there were those who thought I was a tool of the devil. Eventually, I ended up here. But before I came here, I came out of KJV onlyism and eventually came out of TR onlyism as well. And I won't explain that whole process. But I wanted my family to pick a new primary Bible at this point. Now, I didn't feel like my conscience was bound to using the KJV exclusively or even at all. I could use other translations. My family could use other translations. And this was about them understanding their Bible, okay? And so for months during our devotions, now I already explained some of my trust issues, so this is all happening simultaneously, but for months during our family devotions, our time was spent with me doing a devotion, and then all of us reading from these various translations that are up here on the screen, including the Geneva Bible and the Webster's Bible, and then asking them which translations helped them most understand what was going on in the text. We did this for months. When I finally decided to bring this practice to a close, I wanted to buy them whatever translation was helping them most consistently. I assumed that not all of us were going to pick the same translation. And so I asked them which translation had been the one that was helping you most consistently during these months. And boom, translation paralysis. They didn't know which one to pick. No one knew which one to pick. So I asked the question again differently. I said, which of these translations didn't help you as much? How about that? How about we talk about ones that aren't as helpful? My wife was the first to speak, and she said, definitely not the ESV. And she'll tell you today that even she had a little bit of a baggage with the KJV only issue, and the ESV had a ring to it that sounded KJV-ish, and that was part of the issue. But anyway, she said definitely not the ESV. So we took that one off the list. One of my other kids said not the NKJV. Another one of my kids said not the LSB. And so we eliminated quite a few of them from just asking that question. Okay, so now that we've eliminated some, I asked, which one do you think of these that are left, which one was helping you most frequently? Again, Sheila spoke up first, and she said, I think the CSB has been most consistent. And then Kaylin and Miles also agreed. William, on the other hand, he had a different opinion. He had picked the NET. And I said, are you sure? And I thought for sure he was going to pick the NIV since it was generally easier to read. And he was adamant the NET was easier for him. And I said, okay. I did not have the NIRV at the time. I think he might have picked that. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but he picked the NET, and so that was what we did. I picked the LSB as my primary Bible going forward. I was very much impacted by John MacArthur's marketing hype, and I was also had some baggage of formal translation onlyism. And so I went LSB, and my family went CSB. And except for William, who went NET. Again, during family devotions, I would start reading from the LSB, and I would have spent time, and I'd begin explaining the text and breaking it down and telling them what it meant. And then on more than one occasion, my family would be like, that's what the CSB says. I got that from the CSB translation. And I was like, what am I doing? I'm wasting my time. This is right back to where I was from square one. And so I said, from now on, before I go into the family devotion, I'm going to consult the CSB and the NET to see what they say. So I'm not wasting time. I'll focus on something else if it's clearly demonstrated in that translation. And I did that for a time. And before long, I realized the CSB was constantly saying what I was already concluding from studying another Bible. And I found the CSB intended itself to be somewhere between, directly in between a formal and functional translation. It was that middle ground. Eventually, I realized this was what I had been doing all along. I was doing that in this. I've been doing the ESV, NASB, and finding what I thought was the best of the formal and the best of the functional and slamming them together and putting my own translation together to make it easier for people to understand, to see the hints that I wanted to hint at in formal translations and see the English vernacular in the functional. And I realized that the CSB was doing that. And so then I also switched to the CSB, and William was using the NET. So I learned over the years that this really helped shortcut some of my study because it was just clearly said in the CSB. Now, what I want to do at this point is my friend Mark Ward has a video series on what is the best Bible translation, all right? And it's a little bit of a clickbaity title because he has a whole list of best Bible translations. The ESV is the best Bible translation. The CSB is the best Bible translation. The NIV is the best Bible translation. All right, and it's a whole list that all of these are the best Bible translation. And it's a good one. I encourage you to listen to it. But I want to show you the one from the CSB because I thought this one was really helpful for me as well. And Mark Ward doesn't use the CSB as his primary Bible. So I do, and so there might be a sense for some people thinking, well, he uses it as his primary, so he's biased. He doesn't, so I'm trying to take some of the bias out of it. But he does explain, the CSB is not a perfect translation. He pretty much does that in all of these. And he always says the X translation is the best translation for certain people in certain circumstances. That's always how he starts. And then he tries to explain the certain people in the certain circumstances. So it's not the It's not a perfect Bible, and it's a good translation for certain people in certain circumstances. I want him to explain that to you. He's going to get really word nerdy on this. So I'm hoping that I've brought you along far enough that you'll pick up on what he's putting down with his word nerdiness, and you'll be able to retain it. But even if you miss all of it, you'll understand where he's getting to on his final point. So it's about 20 minutes long, so that's going to take up the majority of our class, and I'll close out with some closing comments. Also, I'm going to speed this up just a little bit, so if you're listening to me online already sped up, this is going to sound even faster, okay?
The CSB is the best Bible translation for certain people in certain circumstances. And for random reasons I might explain later, I'm standing outside of the major temple, the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City, to tell you this. I'm coming to you not live from a camp in the beautiful mountains of Utah. I'm preaching from the King James Version, actually, for a little weekend retreat for youth. The churches represented here all use the King James. And because of that, the CSB is not the best Bible for this circumstance, but it is for others. Who are those certain people, and what are those certain circumstances? I'll tell you. And I'll tell you something pretty nerdy cool about the CSB, too, in a minute. Stay tuned, and I'll talk about what math tells us about the CSB. Not kidding. Number one, the CSB is best for you if your church already uses the CSB. If your pastor chose the CSB, be grateful. He did good. The CSB website says that more than 100 scholars from 17 denominations participated in the translation and review of the Holman Christian Standard Bible, first published as a complete text in 2004. The HCSB has been rebranded as of 2017 as the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible. Of the dozens of names on the list of these translators, I recognize nearly 40, meaning either that I'd read something by them or read reviews of something by them or seen them in evangelical biblical studies circles. They hail from many institutions serving evangelical students. They write commentaries and journal articles and dictionary entries and monographs. They do conferences and teach classes. Maybe I've said this too many times on this channel already, but in case you're new here, when you collect this many trained and gifted evangelical scholars to make an English Bible translation, they're probably not going to commit too many obvious errors. They might miss some obscure bits of Hebrew, but then the King James translators themselves said they were simply unsure of the meaning of some obscure Hebrew terms, like names of some plants and animals. Surely, if we had a God's eye view, we would see a few things in the CSB that truly ought to be changed, nay, corrected. But the likelihood that those things are found in significant doctrinal places is very low. The likelihood that they warrant you putting pressure on your pastor to switch to a different translation for your church, if you're already using a contemporary translation, that likelihood is even lower, like lower than the temperature of your grandmother's extremities, lower than molasses in January that's been placed on the bottom shelf in the basement, lower than Larry Flint. Number two, the CSB is best for people who want an optimal blend of quote-unquote readability and quote-unquote accuracy. Now, I just hate putting it this way. Language is super way maximo more complicated and interesting than the picture I get when people bandy these two values about readability versus accuracy. Quit bandying, you guys, totally. I've come to conclude that readability and accuracy aren't really separable in translation anyway. A readable translation that isn't accurate isn't really a translation. It's a paraphrase or something worse. An accurate translation of the Bible that isn't readable isn't accurate, or it's only accurate if the passage was unreadable to its original writer and readers. Are we really going to say this about the Bible, that God inspired unreadable portions or that he used words nobody knew they were misunderstanding? But as often with non-specialists, there is something substantive lying underneath the bandying field. Translators do get to make judgment calls. They have to. And sometimes they have an ear for the way people talk, or even as in the case of Tyndale, the way they should or will talk. Translation is a constant tension between sticking to the forms of the original, the word order and sentence structure and other stuff, and getting the message across to readers. Listen to people talk who have to translate from any language to any other, and you'll hear them say, I totally get what they're saying here in Spanish or French or Urdu or Kazakh, but it's really hard to put into English. Good and intelligent people are permitted to differ about how close to stick to the forms of the original in such cases. They're free to work by feel and not by strict rules, because translation is an art and not just a science. Language isn't reducible to math. People have actually tried, I'm not kidding, to invent languages that are perfectly logical and that eliminate the possibility of misunderstanding. Lobjan is the most famous example I know of. It's almost like a kind of math equation, but the sources I trust, that would be Erika Okrent's popular level book on invented languages, tell me that Lobjan is an ultimate failure. This doesn't surprise me in the least. And yet, what's super interesting is that you can do a little math of a sort on a Bible translation and observe the results of the art. And someone has done it. His name is Andy Wu, and I've met him. And I'm going to walk back the other direction. I've actually interviewed him at Faith Life Bible Tech Conference. Here's the thing. If there's one pro-KJV only meme that I really feel I eviscerated, incinerated, and obliterated, that I beat to death and then burned alive, and after that kept on bread and water for 6 weeks, it's the idea that the Flesch-Kincaid reading level analysis proves that the King James Version is on a 5th grade reading level. There's lies, you know what kind of lies, and statistics. And I showed that people who cite Flesch-Kincaid have no idea what they're really doing when they use it to prove King James readability. So I was skeptical when I first encountered Wu's work. I wasn't sure that computer-generated statistics could tell us very much useful information about Bible translation. But I knew Andy was a serious guy. And I saw quickly that he knew just what he was doing, that he had acted responsibly. That doesn't mean his conclusions are airtight or heaven sent. It means that he helped use a combination of math and careful reading to tell us something useful about the CSB. I'm going to talk you through his report and show you why I think it was so responsible. It's called A Quantitative Evaluation of the Christian Standard Bible, and it compares the CSB with most of the major Bible versions used by evangelical Christians who speak English. Wu is an expert in machine learning, and he helped create the Cascadia syntax graphs of the New Testament, which are used by advanced Logos Bible software users, though they ought to be used by more people, and maybe this video will give you a taste of why. Though Andy Wu's report on the CSB does not reveal his methodology in detail, it's clear enough what he did, and what he did was he measured the literalness and the readability of each translation based on a few criteria I will explain. Then he weighed the balance between the two. I'm on record as saying that computers cannot read, and this is true. I believe it will always be true. But with the help of humans who can read, computers can mimic certain aspects of reading, things humans like Wu have taught them to recognize. I don't fully understand all this, not the computer side. I do understand the linguistic side, however. Wu used 2 measures for literalness, one of which I've talked about in detail on this channel. And he used 2 measures for readability, one of which I've talked about in massive detail on this channel. His measures for literalness were the transfer rate of syntactic relations and the consistency rate of word choices. Syntactic relations is just technical terminology for the basic meaning-carrying units of a sentence. You know them as subject, verb, and object. Basically, people like Wu have taught computers to guess, I assume pretty accurately, which words in a given English sentence fit in which slot, subject, verb, or object, plus a few other less important relations. And they've actually also gone through and marked by hand all these syntactic relations in the Greek New Testament, at least that, maybe the Hebrew Old Testament. It produces a tree that looks like this, showing where the subject and verb are in a given sentence and how other words relate to them. Let me stop and point out that I just cannot imagine a situation where a computer could accurately diagram every sentence in the Bible. Only a human can do this. Like my dissertation advisor, Randy Leedy of ntgreekguide.com, who diagrammed the entire Greek New Testament. Diagramming requires understanding what you're reading, and computers can't do that. But its simplest aspects, subject, verb, and object, can be guessed at by computers, apparently, especially in English. Wu had the computer diagram the Hebrew and Greek texts to display the subjects, verbs, and objects. That is, Wu used, I believe, handmade syntax graphs of the Greek New Testament, and possibly of portions of the Hebrew Bible. Then, if I'm understanding correctly, he used syntax graphs that were automatically generated by computer, what humans taught it to do. Then he used reverse interlinear data, basically little lines humans drew between the original languages and the English, to see how often the diagrams matched up between the original languages and the English. The more a given translation's sentence diagrams matched those of the originals, the more literal it might be considered to be. Now this might raise a question. Why doesn't every Bible translation perfectly match the Hebrew and Greek syntactic relations? Matching subjects to subjects, verbs to verbs, and objects to objects. That seems pretty straightforward, right? I mean, wouldn't that be the very first job of every translator? Let me just talk through one example. I don't have access to Wu's data, so I can't verify that this is the kind of thing that he was measuring, but I feel reasonably confident. Think of Ephesians 2, 1-2. Very literally, the Greek reads, "And you being dead in the trespasses and the sins of you, in which once you walked according to the age of this world," etc. This is just the beginning of a crazy long Pauline Greek sentence, one which isn't really a sentence, because the main verb does not actually come along until, well, actually, it never technically comes along. Randy Leedy's stellar notes to his Greek New Testament diagrams explain very well what Paul is doing here. He gets so wrapped up in his qualifiers and explanations for what we were up to when we were dead, that he ends up ending the clause before he can get to the main verb. Nobody that I've seen has the heart, however, to make a non-sentence in English translation when they come to this passage. So they divvy up Paul's long non-sentence in various ways. You being dead is a participial phrase, something Greek loves to do, but English does not. So many English translations, quote unquote, change the syntactic relations here to make the English flow more naturally. They turn you being dead into a finite verb. You were dead. pretty much every major English translation, including the King James Version, does something that is technically different from the Greek here. Good and smart Christians disagree about how often and in what circumstances translators should be free to adjust syntactic relations to make sentences flow more naturally in the target language. But every single Bible translation does this sort of thing. They only differ on how often and under what circumstances. Wu mapped those differences of opinion. We'll see his stats in a minute. He also mapped how often translations practice concordance, as I've called it, or what he called consistency rate of word choices. The King James translators actually talk about this specifically in their preface, and they specifically reject this as a principle. They say that it should be okay to translate a given Hebrew word with several different English ones in different places, like journeys in some places and travels in others. That is just one of many examples that they give. Wu knows, as the King James translators did, that it is impossible to maintain perfect consistency in word choice in Bible translation. Language simply does not work that way. As Wu says, exact lexical equivalence between languages is rare. Lexical just means the semantic range of words, what words can mean, what senses they can bear. They just don't match language to language between any two. And as I often say, God gave us this situation, so chill. What this means is that some translations are more consistent in rendering a given Hebrew or Greek word with a specific English one. Some are less consistent. They prize using an English word that fits well in the context over using one that could sort of work, but only if you're set on consistency, which, as someone said, is the hobgoblin of little minds, which isn't quite fair, but there's some truth in it. Concordance can be measured only if humans have gone through and measured, as has been done in Logos, which is why it's an advanced tool, and done what's called mapping, showing which English words are translations of which Hebrew and Greek words. We will see the results of Wu's measures of concordance in a bit. Now we turn to Wu's two readability measures, syntactic fluency rate and common vocabulary rate. The latter will be an easier concept to understand for viewers of my channel. It measures the conformity of vocabulary to current usage. It assumes that a translation is easier to read if more of the words it uses are in the daily usage corpus of the target language. This is very like what I do in step 5 of my false friends process, where I use the news on the web corpus to see how do today's writers actually use various English words. A corpus, that's just Latin for body, is just a huge, huge body of written or transcribed texts. The idea behind a corpus is the foundation of all linguistics, something that most people outside the field don't understand in my experience. And that idea is that the speakers and writers of a language are the ones who define what the language is and what its rules are. The lexicographers at Merriam-Webster are not telling us what words should mean in some heaven-sent way. They're describing what words in fact do mean. What do people right now use them to mean? This measure of Wu's is necessarily inexact, therefore, because, as my 50 False Friends series shows, the King James Version might use a current word but in an older sense, and so could some of the contemporary versions. But still, this measure works best on contemporary translations. But when combined with other measures, it does help contribute to the overall picture. The syntactic fluency rate is similar, but it measures not words so much as sentence patterns. It assumes that a translation is easier to read if its sentence patterns are more similar to those found in daily usage. So instead of comparing syntactic relations between the original language text and the English translations, it compares them between English translations and a corpus of written English. So that was pretty tough, complicated. If you followed all that, let's get to the stats. What did Wu come up with? What were his results? I think the results tend to validate his methods because they match up pretty well with the subjective feel of lots of readers, which is, I think, the best measure, just one that's harder to quantify. You've seen the formal to functional spectrum graphic. Wu's work essentially reproduces it with some minor shakeups. Using Wu's measures, the ESV transfers syntactic relations more consistently than any other translation. The New Living Translation does it the least often. Using Wu's measures, the King James Version is more consistent in its use of the principle of concordance than any other major translation. This is so interesting because the King James translators specifically denied feeling obligated to do this. And as I showed in my Incredinasby video, Robert Young actually took them to task for this very perceived failure. Wu is a scholar. He knows what he's doing. He openly admits that his evaluation metrics are still quite basic because he's only evaluating words rather than senses of words. But he points out that no one has made a complete database of word senses in Hebrew and Greek Bibles. And computers can only count what people have fed into their electronic maws. If you buy the measures of literalness that Wu used, you actually get the ESV at the top, the NASB, then the New King James, and at the bottom, as anyone familiar with these translations would have expected, you get the NET, NIV, and NLT. And lo and behold, in the middle is the CSB. Note that the figures of translations at the top are extremely close to one another. We're not talking about massive differences here, but there is still a clear statistically significant difference between the top and the bottom. The ESV is clearly more literal by Wu's measures than is the NLT. Wu also shares the stats for his two readability measures. As expected, the graph flips. The New Living Translation is more syntactically fluent and uses more common vocabulary. It matches current English better than other translations. The King James is at the bottom in both cases. But at least in common vocabulary rate, the difference among contemporary translations is not large. The distance between the New Living Translation at the top and the New King James at the bottom of the modern versions is very small. In other words, all contemporary translations do a good job of using common vocabulary. The King James is the outlier, as I would certainly have predicted, but it's not at 0%, it's at 65%. This helps validate what I've said so often in this channel. The King James is still largely intelligible, but it's in the process over time because of language change of becoming less intelligible. I'm taking you through this report about as fast as I can. Now it's time to skip to the summary graph. Put simply, the New Living Translation, New International Version, and New English Translation are connected in one group that is more readable and less literal. The ESV, the New American Standard Bible, and the New King James Version are quite close, even overlapping on a spot that is less readable, though not a lot less, and more literal. And lo and behold, the CSB is almost right on the line, bisecting the X and Y axes. In other words, it is the evangelical translation that best balances readability and accuracy. I must stress that at every single point in Wu's analysis, someone could measure the data differently, and someone could certainly weigh the results differently. I don't even think Wu is saying that literalness should be viewed as superior to not so literalness. I certainly don't say that. But bring your values to his data, and it will help you judge the value of various Bible translations. The burden is certainly on others to do this kind of work with anything even remotely approaching the sophistication and care that Wu has used. This little report is, in my mind, quite an achievement. It's one of those significant achievements, however, like E equals MC squared, that few people can really understand. Hopefully now, because of this video, a few more can understand. I encourage you to read the report for yourself. The link is in the show notes. I think there is a lot to learn from his methods. Therefore, because of these two previous points, the CSB is best for people who can't make up their minds between formal and functional translations. You know, I'm kind of one of those people. I used to assume early in seminary that literal translations, like the New American Standard Bible, were simply superior to dynamic ones like the NIV. Then I came to feel, maybe a little ways into seminary, that each approach was useful, but that still I had to figure out once and for all which of the two approaches was better.
Sunday, ESV versus NIV showdown. Special appearances by Arnold Schwarzenegger, Vince McMahon, and John Piper.
Then I started to realize that I didn't want either side to win. I liked having both kinds of Bible translations, and I liked being able to turn to one or the other in specific situations. Evangelism is a good time for the NIV. Expository preaching is a good time for the ESV. I felt, and still do. I've also come to realize from experience something I was warned about by some people at my church in college. Not every church is full of people with formal Bible training, as in my Christian college town. It really does seem like the CSB is getting the reputation of being a good middle ground, formal enough to be useful for close Bible study, functional enough to be accessible to people who don't read quite as well as people in Christian college towns. Still, I insist, we're not talking about a massive difference between the ESV and the CSB, or between the CSB and the NIV, but that's just it. The CSB is in between the ESV and NIV. Number 4. The CSB is the best Bible translation for people who feel the CSB buzz that's going on right now. The King James Version has been slammed by lots of people who, crazy, I know, think that overall it's too archaic. NIV, it's been slammed by people who think it's part of a secret feminist cabal. The ESV has been slammed by people, including this morning when I woke up on Twitter, who think it's part of a patriarchalist cabal. The New American Standard Bible has been slammed by lots of people for being wooden and stilted. The NASB 2020 hasn't been out long enough to get a new reputation. The New Living Translation has been slammed by skateboarders for speaking less formally than they do. Now, most of that was tongue-in-cheek, but what I'm saying is that a lot of the major English Bible translations out there in the evangelical space have been out long enough to have collected groups of detractors who kind of speak in unison. The CSB, it seems, kind of doesn't have that. It isn't attached to any agenda in the public mind. It doesn't send a signal yet about what tribe you're in. And there's an appeal there. I like that. If I were planting a church today, I would strongly consider the CSB for this reason, and because it hits such a happy medium between formal and functional renderings. Also, the CSB had a whole committee of scholars dedicated to catching things that the translators accidentally overlooked. It was called the Translation Oversight Committee. Cool. I'm kidding. That was truly not funny. Next week, the NIV is the best Bible translation.
Myself back up here. Yeah, that was long, and he said a lot, and some of it went probably over your head, and you're welcome to go back and listen to this again on your own since it is recorded. I did ask Mark if it was okay if I kept his video in its full from beginning to end, and he said that was totally fine. So normally that would cause you like a copyright strike or something, but I did get permission. And so there was a lot there, a lot of linguistic heaviness there. But the bottom line was this chart. That's where all of that was coming to, was Andy Wu's conclusion of the chart. And I didn't get into the CSB translation earlier this week. I will get into it this coming week. But when you read the CSB's preface, this was the goal for them, was to try to find this spot right here between the formal and the functional. That was their intended goal. They said, there's a gap here. We've got formal translations and we've got functional translations, and we see the benefit to both. And we want to produce a translation that fills this gap. And the only other translation that was close to filling that gap was the NRSV. And so for a lot of people, that was not an option. And so the CSB, I think, actually achieved a better middle ground than the NRSV did. But that was their goal, to fill that gap. There was a clear gap. We clearly had a left and a right, and they wanted to be more in that center. That was how I have always felt when I was doing my Bible study and I was teaching. I wanted it to be easy enough for the lowest common denominator in my class, and yet have enough in it so that the guy in my class who was well educated didn't feel like I was talking down to him, right? That I was talking at his level as well. I am always trying to bridge that gap to as much as I can. And I'm not saying I'm the most educated person. There are definitely more educated people than me that I teach, but I don't want them to feel like they're not getting anything. And so the CSB struck a chord with me because its translation philosophy was my translation philosophy before I ever knew it existed. And so the fact that my family picked it was evidence of that for me. They were picking up on what we were talking about in our devotions, which was, hey, here's some little things that this formal translation is picking up on. And by the way, it sounds like this in English when you spell it out. And that was really helpful. And so I ended up adopting the CSB reluctantly initially. It was only because my family picked it. I didn't pick it. I picked more formal because I felt that was better. And I've now changed my philosophy about that. I say that was always my translation philosophy when it came to teaching. When it came to teaching, preaching, and evangelism, I always wanted that to hit that middle ground between the two. But in my own personal study, I always wanted the most formal. That's how I felt. Now I just start with the CSB because it does so much of the work for me. I'm like, oh, okay, I see where you got that. Oh, I see where you got that too. I would have done that. I would have come to this conclusion eventually, or sometimes it surprises me, and that helps me too. So ultimately, when it comes to my personal decision of picking the CSB as my primary translation, that does not have to be yours. If you've already got something that's working for you, got a system that's working for you, stick with it. Keep doing it. If you don't, I can kind of show you what my system is, real brief, as we close out the class. I think because of what I'm doing, the history of our Bibles and working through all of these translation things, people inevitably ask me all the time what my preferred translation is, or what translation should I use? Those are the two questions. What's my preferred one, and which one should I use, the person saying that? And I always tell them, use the one that edifies you most, and don't use only one. Use more than one, and use the one that edifies you most. Use the one that when you pick it up, you look forward to picking it up, right? You go to your Bible, you're going to go to your bookshelf, and you're like, I don't want to read my Bible today. And you got to force yourself to do it. And we all have to do that at times. But there are times where you're like, you know what? I just want to sit down and read that one. That one helps me. That one's easy. That one's not making me struggle, right? Or you might say, that one helps me. It picks up on things that I really enjoy. It really is helping me to get closer to God. That's what I want. That's what I want you to do. So if you got a translation that's doing that for you, great. Keep using it. The other thing that I really liked about the CSB was when I did run across situations where I thought there might be another way to handle this. 9 times out of 10, it was already in the footnote. So the footnotes in the CSB were super helpful for me in realizing why translators went a different way. And they were really good at identifying that for me. And so for me, when I started this years ago, I started collecting translations and reading everything. And I easily have, if you open my Logos Bible software and you hit the compare translation buttons, at least 24 translations are going to come up for the New Testament, and more are going to come up for the Old Testament. Okay, it'd probably be closer to 30, 35 are going to come up in the Old Testament. And I would read through every single one of them, and I would read through all of their footnotes, and I would read, and that was before I even got into study Bibles and commentaries, just reading translations. Over the time of doing this for a very long time, I began to start seeing patterns. Certain translations kept hitting what other translations were hitting and picking up what other ones weren't hitting. And so what I realized was these 5 translations up here, I would say probably 98 to 99% of the times, gave me the entire spectrum of my 24 translations between what was in their text and what was in their footnotes. Between that, I could get almost everything I would be looking for, all of the things that I would want to dig into in my study with these 5 translations. I would start with the CSB and its footnotes. I would move to the NLT to make sure I was just really understanding what this was in common English. I would move to the LEB to make sure I wasn't missing any of the Hebrew nuances. Then I would move to the NET to pick up on translation difficulties and textual criticism. And then I moved to the NKJV to find out which group chose which reading when it came to those 3 camps, TR Majority and Textus Receptus. And I would do all of that, and I would find that all of that was like 98% of my work. And I was able to cut down hours to half an hour in most places, like just as I was studying with these 5 translations. And so next week will be our last week in the auditorium together. I'm looking forward to that. But overall, this is how I landed. It's a way to help those who maybe are floundering. They don't have a system. They're trying to figure out their system. They have a system, but it's not working for them. They want more. This is mine. If this helps you, praise the Lord. If it doesn't help you, throw it out. This is just me. Okay, this is not the only right way to do it. There's 1,000 ways to skin this cat. This just happens to be the way I have found that skinning this cat is most efficient, if you want to stick with that analogy to its grossness. So, again, if you're feeling overwhelmed, hopefully this helps. If you've got a system, great. If you just are sitting down and reading your Bible and being edified with that, great. But when you get into study, okay, you definitely need to pick up more than one translation because, as I've said from the beginning of the class, your translations are your best resource for Greek and Hebrew. Before you go to a concordance, before you go to a lexicon or anything of that nature, your translations are going to be your best guardrails for not making mistakes, saying things that shouldn't be said, and picking the right senses. Use multiple translations, however you go about doing that, and dig into your word and get closer to God. I'll do at least, I plan to do 1 midweek lesson this week, and then we'll meet again next week. You all are dismissed. Thank you.